Please subscribe to our channel, Pacific Front Untold, and be sure to leave a comment after watching a video.
World War II, especially the Pacific theater, relied heavily on aircraft to effectively cover large distances and fight. As a result, air power made World War II significantly different than World War I. For the Pacific Front, aircraft were necessary to keep shipping lanes open, help win naval battles, and employ important strategies like island hopping, which helped Allied forces cover more land and eventually launch a mainland invasion of Japan. The unprecedented production of aircraft and other wartime tools in the United States during World War II was another factor in the eventual success of Allied power. This massive production not only helped the war and brought technological innovation, it also stimulated the U.S. economy. The production allowed the country to recover from the Great Depression of the 1930s and increased diversity in the labor market, as women and people of color were employed in the factories producing these products. This unprecedented minority employment set the stage for increased equality across society even after the end of the war. Moreover, technologically, this era was exceptional in that it was the first and only time military aircraft was mass-produced. The P-40 fighter was a plane employed by the Americans, especially at the beginning of the war. In particular, the Flying Tigers, or the American Volunteer Group, used the P-40 in their campaign against Japan. The Flying Tigers were American pilots hired by China to fight against Japan before the U.S. officially joined the war. Despite combating Japan's more prominent and advanced aviation fleet, they were known for their effectiveness. However, because the Flying Tigers fought before the U.S. had officially joined the war, the American pilots that made up the Flying Tigers had to renounce military ties to aid in this fight, though they were eventually able to rejoin as part of the U.S. military after the attack on Pearl Harbor, with official U.S. involvement in World War II. P-40s were also used to engage Japanese aircraft during the attack on Pearl Harbor and during the invasion of the Philippines in December of 1941. The P-40 has an interesting story because it was objectively inferior to the majority of Japanese and German fighters, but after the destruction of Pearl Harbor, it was the only plane able to be produced in large quantities and was thus often used by the U.S. military. The P-40 was a single-person, single-engine ground attack aircraft that was first produced in 1938. It was designed to be easily and quickly produced in American factories, an edge Americans had over the Japanese, who had more advanced technology but produced far fewer planes. The P-40's strength came in its bomb capacity, but it also made it very heavy and thus slower and less maneuverable. Unlike the P-40, which was utilized out of necessity, despite being more technologically primitive, the American B-29 was one of the most cutting-edge aircraft of the time. It had a 10-gun defensive armament that was remotely controlled by turrets, and the crew was separated into 3 pressurized compartments in order to be more space-efficient and comfortable. The B-29 was the first military plane to employ pressurization and remote-control power turrets. The pressurization in particular was notable because it allowed the crew to move around the aircraft freely without oxygen masks, despite high altitudes. Despite its advanced technological capabilities, the B-29 had issues because it was rushed into combat without the standard testing program and was thus very hard to operate. However, over the course of the war, it underwent many modifications and became one of the best U.S. aircraft. It had unprecedented range and bomb load capacity, though this did make it a heavy aircraft. The B-29 was notably employed in the U.S. military's island hopping strategy, in which aircraft were used to cover the large distance to Japan. These aircraft, namely the B-29s, targeted key islands to use as a less distant base for U.S. operations. As a result, they avoided or hopped over strongly defended islands and cut off essential supply lanes to Japan. The B-29 was also used in the nuclear bombings of Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The B-29 was employed in the Pacific because of its great range of capabilities. As enemy aircrafts waned with strengthened Allied power in the Pacific towards the war's end, a new version of the B-29 was developed. This version eliminated guns in favor of increased speed and bomb load. There was no need for guns without enemy aircraft to combat. The A6M fighter was designed based on specifications desired by the Japanese military. However, at the time of the release of the specs, Nakajima, Mitsubishi's competitor, deemed the specifications impossible and abandoned the pursuit. Nevertheless, because of these specifications, the A6M was one of the most technologically advanced planes. As a result, it was one of Japan's biggest strengths, especially at the beginning of the war. Throughout the war, the A6M was Japan's most successful fighter, and as a result, it was the most widely produced aircraft in Japan. The A6M fighter led the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Compared to the 352 American planes damaged or destroyed in that attack, only 2 Zeros were successfully shot down. Besides that, the A6M was used as the primary Japanese naval fighter throughout the war. The A6M's strength came in its speed, maneuverability, and range. The A6M was a one-person aircraft developed for the Navy. It had a streamlined fuselage and low forward-set wings. At the start of the war, the plane was updated to improve visibility and gunpowder. The updated version was equipped with both machine guns and cannon armament. This version was released in July 1940 and was used in service against the Chinese, where it was very successful. In the first A6M encounter against the Chinese Air Force, every single Chinese fighter was shot down, and not one A6M was damaged. The A6M's biggest flaw, which was exploited by the Allied forces when they were finally able to study the plane's design in 1942, was its lack of armor. This knowledge allowed the U.S. to adapt its plans to compete with the A6M. Because of this, the A6M was a far less successful and formidable fighter against the Allies, and the tide of the war began to shift. Aircraft was essential in determining who held the power in World War II. Because of this, it was a race between the most technologically advanced planes and the most efficiently mass-produced ones. As these factors changed, and the U.S. began to compete technologically with Japan, and mass production became more important, supply lines to Japan were cut off, and the Allied forces were able to prevail.